Danny, what's the biggest misconception Americans have about U.S. foreign policy?
That the United States is able to be the world leader going forward into the future, when in actuality, its power is in relative decline, and that we have some very difficult questions to ask ourselves about what the U.S.'s role in the world should be going forward.
What could go right? I'm Zachary Carabell, the founder of the Progress Network, joined as always by my co-host, Emma Varvaloucas, the executive director of the Progress Network. Today, we're going to look at foreign policy, which seems to occupy less and less mind share in the American public consciousness. We're going to look at this from the lens of two writers, podcast hosts, and critics who are very much of the left. So, Emma, let's have you tell us a bit more about these delightful individuals we're about to talk to.
So today we are going to talk to, first is Derek Davison. He's a journalist and an analyst that focuses on foreign policy, and he runs a Substack called Foreign Exchanges. And he's here with his podcast co-host, Daniel Bessner. The podcast is called American Prestige. And Daniel is a historian and a professor at the University of Washington, also, again, specializing in foreign policy, and the author of a book called Democracy in Exile. And again, as you mentioned, they're both firm critics of American interventionism. So excited to hear what they have to say, and especially how it pertains to the new world of the Trump administration that we are now in.
Cool. Let's do it. Danny and Derek, it's such a pleasure to have you on What Could Go Right today. You are both running a really interesting Substack, Foreign Exchanges, which you both write for, but also lots of other voices are contributing to, and you have a fascinating podcast. How did you both get into the focus on foreign policy? You know, my impression these days, having myself once done a PhD in foreign policy and thought that was a thing, is that less and less, certainly at a domestic electoral level in the United States, does anybody really seem to care about foreign policy? Obviously, there are exceptions to that, Gaza, Ukraine to a degree, but as a top of mind issue relative to the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe even the 90s, and certainly after 2001, it does seem like a much less engaged public when it comes to these issues. So I'm just curious how you got into this, given that this seems to be an area that most people are running away from rather than toward.
Just to clarify, Derek actually runs Foreign Exchanges. It's his Substack. We co-host a podcast, American Prestige. I would never steal Substack valor, so I just needed to make that clear.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
The way that I got into it, I'm a millennial. I think I'm an elder millennial. So I was politicized in the wake of the Iraq War. And so the Iraq War, like you just mentioned, was a very hot topic of conversation during my early college years and really throughout college. So my senior year of college, I actually interned in New York City at the Council on Foreign Relations. And that got me interested in thinking through the relationship between intellectuals and foreign policymaking. And that's what I studied for my PhD thesis at Duke University in North Carolina. And I've kind of been writing about foreign policy ever since. So that's been about, 17 years now where I've been writing and thinking about foreign policy.
I came to it from a failed attempt to get a PhD in early modern Iranian history, which I eventually decided was not for me, and then had to try and figure out how I could make the previous, 8 years of my life turn into a career.
You had to figure out how to market your expertise on the Qajar Sultanate.
Yeah, exactly. So,
oh yeah, we're actually funded by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all the
That's
nations,
a tough sell,
Raytheon.
Could have tried that, I guess. But we moved to DC at the same time that I was leaving the PhD program, which thrust the idea of doing something in U.S. foreign policy in my face, and I did it. So yeah, that was pretty much it. I feel like I kind of backdoored my way into it, but that's my story.
Do you both regret your choices? No, I'm joking. That was not the actual question.
Every day of my life.
I'm going to jump into the meat here. I'm going to actually crib from the American Prestige podcast description because I think it's a good lead-in. And the description essentially says that media organizations generally, they assume that the United States should dominate the world through military and economic might. And the podcast asks what foreign policy would look like if the interests of all the people in the world were taken into account rather than just American interests. For me, to pose to you guys is, what would that look like? And feel free to take any top of mind examples or maybe some lesser known ones.
For sure. So I think the thing to really understand there is that concept emerges from a historical investigation. I think that we now have 70 plus years of evidence of what the United States' global empire actually does in the world. And it just turns out that it was actually incredibly violent, that the dreams that were set out for it in the 1940s when it was established on the global scale really didn't come to fruition. So, for example, the United States tried to overturn foreign regimes somewhere around 65 times, succeeding in about 24 of those cases. But if you were targeted for U.S. intervention, you were more likely to experience things like mass deaths, displacement, etc. You also have the examples of the wars we all know: Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, etc., which led to the death and deracination and dispossession of tens of millions of people. And you also have just the sheer fact that the American global imperium has basically allowed Americans to promote a consumer capitalist culture that I think in retrospect is one of the major reasons that there's such devastating climate change, that we consume an enormous amount of energy here. We consume an enormous amount of raw materials. So the notion that American primacy, that the United States needed to be the world's prime military and economic power, has actually done incredible damage to the world. So the question is, what would that look like going forward? And I think we come from a couple of assumptions. The first and most important thing is that we don't believe any other nation really has the global designs that the United States had, for a couple of reasons. One, after World War II, and even more so after the collapse of the Soviet Union between 1989 and 1991, the United States was genuinely uniquely powerful. It was able to do something like construct a global empire with hundreds of military bases. We presently have about 750 global military bases. Neither China, let alone Russia, which is absolutely in a weakened position, could do that. And even more important, perhaps, it doesn't seem like either China or Russia wants to be genuinely global in the way that the United States has been. It's very clear, given Putin's invasion of Ukraine, that Russia seeks a form of regional hegemony. And I think it's also pretty clear that China seeks to be the dominant power in East Asia, broadly speaking, or what we in the United States christened about a decade ago, right, Derek? The Indo-Pacific region. But these are regional projects. These are not global projects like the United States itself has been regionally hegemonic in East Asia for decades. So I think what that would look like is the United States restraining its military might first, and then you see the emergence of other powers in their regions. And in an ideal world, this would be something that would be managed. It wouldn't just happen, for example, that the United States just retreats if China decides to invade Taiwan, that there would be years of planning for this, what we think, I think, believe is an inevitable contingency, an inevitable thing that's going to happen. So that's what I think it would look like. It would look like the United States moving back from some of its forward positions in the world. It would look like the United States trying to actually genuinely cooperate with other powers in a way that it really hasn't done in a century or so, if you want to look back that long. And so it would be a total reformation of the United States' approach to, and really Americans' approach to the world. I just want to say, we don't think that's in the offing, but that's a counterfactual world we'd like to live in.
That is all factually correct. And it is definitely true that Americans, when they conceive of their post-World War II global system, think of it as a peace and prosperity system, a Madeleine Albright indispensable nation system, that we are the hinge of a global order that has created a sphere of prosperity globally. So my pushback is, isn't there some degree in which at least the sphere of prosperity part is accurate? Meaning, until the past few years, there had been a gradual decrease of global violence. It's certainly true that there was much more violence than we either acknowledged, and certainly more violence that we were at the origin of than we usually tend to acknowledge. But it is also true that the past 20, 30 years have seen this kind of emergence of a global middle class. The end of the Cold War did unleash a certain amount of economic growth around the world that certainly isn't attributable to the United States per se. I mean, the fact that India finally became more of an economic powerhouse, or China has some relationship to the United States, but also a lot of relationship to their own just internal development. Reflect on that. And then there's a whole chorus now, particularly someone like Robert Kagan, who at Brookings, he's talked a lot about, we remain this indispensable thing. And if the United States retreats, it'll just be some sort of anarchic world.
Yeah, that's ahistorical. So the metaphor of physics used, like this idea of vacuum, a metaphor borrowed from physics in like the 1930s because everyone was reading physics back then, is not an accurate reflection of historical reality. If a power retreats, it doesn't mean that a great power just goes in to take its place. The problem with a lot of international relations thinking broadly is that was literally forged in the fires of World War II. So it's framed by that experience. So a lot of the metaphors, a lot of the assumptions of it, I think are just empirically wrong. And I've written about this in relation to John Mersheimer and Michael Walzer and other people like that. This is a question that I think we often receive. And then how do you disentangle US global imperialism and economic development, which basically occur at the same time? It is my personal opinion that you would be able to get economic development and economic modernization and really industrialization and post-industrialization without the US global empire. And that in a lot of instances, the particular way that the United States empire actually funneled money might have distorted things on the ground, for example, in Vietnam and in South Korea and elsewhere. I think that to get to your point, it was really good to be in the core during most of the era of American empire. It was great if you're the United Kingdom or France or West Germany and then Germany. It was much less great if you were in Vietnam or if you were in Latin America or if you were in Asia and the United States was constantly intervening in your politics. For example, about 20 million people, historians have discovered, died in Cold War era conflicts. And I think that the historical record shows that the United States bears prime, if not total responsibility for the Cold War. So in effect, I think you could have the sorts of processes of modernization that you were describing and that they were not in fact reliant on the American global position, the United States being prime, and that in many instances that primacy, again, wound up distorting things on the ground. Derek, I don't know what you think.
I mean, to go back to the original question, I think what we would like to see, and I can draw from a very recent example, Lebanon just formed a new government. It's been 2 years or since Lebanon's had a government. Prior to that, the government formation process, Lebanese politicians had to deal with the interference of the United States at such a granular level that we were complaining about who was going to be finance minister. We were dictating cabinet choices to another country. The world that I would like to live in is a world where the United States doesn't do that. And really, the ideal world, I think, is the world where the United States can't do that, where the levers of power, the dollar, the military, the bases aren't there anymore. But that's not realistic. What could be realistic, I think, is a world where the United States makes the choice not to intervene in other countries' affairs in that way, in that destructive kind of overarching manner. One of the things we talked about on the show, at least early on when we were, kind of explaining what the show was about, was what I think we would like to do is change the way that questions about world events are asked in Washington from something happens and the response is, okay, how does the United States respond to this? What should the United States do about this? To at least at that first level, like the first question being, should the United States have anything to do with this? And often I think the answer would be no if we were being objective about it. And I think just making that mental shift would be a huge development positively for the world and I think for the United States, for our politics domestically.
The last statement is somewhat separate from the first, meaning it may be better for the United States to have a less engaged, less interventionist approach to foreign policy. The other is, let me take the case of Lebanon, right? Without the United States intervening, it's not clear that the Saudis and the Russians and the others wouldn't intervene. In 2017, the Saudis held the prime minister of Lebanon pretty much hostage for a few days,
Right, but they did that with the support. I mean, the United States backs Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has regional reach in part because they get weapons and support from the United States. So we're at the root of that anyway.
I'm just saying, if we were not at the root of it, the Saudis are perfectly capable of buying high-priced weapons from another supplier. There are some weapons that only we can supply, but fighter jets are kind of globally prevalent. There are a lot of countries that make their own fighter jets. It's a weird aspect of the global ecosystem. Not a lot of people make, really good missiles, but a bunch of people make really good jets. So I'm just pushing back on it is certainly true that you can make an argument of a certain type of foreign policy that the United States has come to practice is not good for the United States, not good for its democracy, and is questionably good for the world, although it might be good for the US economy. But it is equally true that in the absence of that, it's not clear the world would be either better or worse for it. It would certainly be different.
It's hard to prove a counterfactual, but I don't think there's a question about the disastrous role the United States has played in the Middle East since World War II. Almost philosophically, I don't agree with the idea that if the United States retreats, another state would necessarily come in. I actually think the American fantasy of global dominance is linked to a uniquely millenarian American Protestantism that goes back to before the founding of the Republic. This universalistic notion that the United States could save the world. And when basically Protestantism became secularized over the course of the first half of the 20th century, a lot of those ideas were literally imported by people like John Foster Dulles, former, related to missionaries and things like that, into the US foreign policy establishment. And I think a lot of those ideas were actually read onto other nations. For example, if you read George Kennan's 1946 long telegram, and he says Marxist Leninism is going to dominate the world, I think we're pretty clear now that the Soviet Union didn't have the capabilities or even really the will to dominate the world in the way that the United States did, and that what Americans do is that we read our own universalistic policies onto other nations. China has no desire to dominate in the Western Hemisphere. China wants to be the most important player in world regions like any emergent power, but I don't think if you run back history again and China is the world hegemon in 1945 and the United States isn't, I don't think that the Middle East is going to be as disastrous as what happened under the United States.
To go back to the example of Lebanon, the reason that the Saudis kidnapped Saad al-Hariri and held him in custody was because they were frustrated over the influence that Iran via Hezbollah and its other proxies has in Lebanese politics. But the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran, yes, the Saudis could do that anyway. They could meddle in whatever affairs they want. They've got enough money to do that without the U.S. But the reason that rivalry exists is because the U.S. organizes the politics of the Middle East in an pro and anti-Iran alliances, because that serves U.S. foreign interests, that serves U.S. interests in the region. If you look at just the perception of a U.S. withdrawal or downplaying that the importance of that region in U.S. foreign policy, just the perception of that in the last few years prompted the Saudis and the Iranians to normalize relations. So the overarching structure of the politics of the region would be fundamentally different. I don't think that you can say that if the U.S. were not involved, it would just be, the Saudis being involved, where the Saudis running amok, or, some other country running amok. It would fundamentally reshape the politics of the region. And this could happen all over the world if the U.S. pulled back and showed some restraint. It would be a completely different world. As Danny said, it's hard to prove a counterfactual, but particularly in this case, I think to say what the world would look like if the U.S. was not playing the dominant role that it insists on playing is very difficult to say, because there's so much of it that rests on the architecture of U.S. national interest.
Derek, in the site you manage, you do a lot of articles just about history. The Janissaries, the ancient
Right.
Persian. I mean, there's a lot of interesting kind of eclectic stuff mixed in with very, very contemporary stuff. In fact, I think when I was looking at the page, there's an article about what are we supposed to do now under Trump Part 2, and then there's something about how did the Janissaries or the Mamluks take over, and what do medieval women have to do with society? So is this just because you're a man of eclectic passions and therefore you've assembled a site thereof, or is there a theory of the case?
Yeah, so no, there really isn't. A lot of the pieces that are on the site that are purely historical are things that I wrote years ago when I was fresh out of grad school and scrambling to find freelance work and just looking for something to do, and maybe hoping to build a website that people would be interested in reading, and kind of, going from there. And that was what I had to write about, because I was just out of grad school where I studied Islamic history. And so there's a lot of that stuff that I just kind of kept bringing with me to different places. It was on WordPress for a long time, and then I moved to Substack. The podcast, I think what you're talking about with the Mamluks and the medieval women, those are podcast interviews that I've done for foreign exchanges that I do, one every 3 months or so, that are just interviews with, authors who write about things that I can plausibly not talk about contemporary politics as a break for everybody, since the rest of the newsletter is very focused on what things that are happening in the world right now. I feel like the occasional chance that I get to do a podcast, I like to give people a break from that. Myself above all, really.
What's your feeling about the connective tissue between the past and the present? I mean, my take has always been the glory of learning more about history is one, recognizing that, there is no golden age per se, that human beings have been muddling through whatever human beings have been muddling through in various forms kind of forever. And at least for me, that gives me a certain amount of calm about the present. I mean, it doesn't mean that we're not going to just, it's equally true that really bad shit happens and that is no assurance to it happening again. But the flip side of that is it's a little easier to have a little more equanimity about the present when you reflect on just how complicated the past is. Again, that's me. Like that's my way of internalizing the past as a guide to the present. It is not either there's a perfect analog. That's always a mistake. At least in my view, there's never a perfect analog. Anyway, I'm just wondering, like, is this just like, I get to take a breath of fresh air because I get to look at the Mamluks, or is there actually a degree to which that then feeds into your sensibility about how we understand our present?
I don't do that explicitly with this stuff. There are occasional references to contemporary things. I interviewed Eckhart Fromm, who wrote a book about the Assyrian Empire, and I thought, okay, we're going to get through this whole interview and not talk about anything that's happened in the last, century, let alone the last 20 years. But of course, we had to talk about ISIS destroying Assyrian sites in the Middle East, so we did talk about contemporary stuff. So yeah, I mean, I don't try to do it explicitly, but I think that's a good way to look at it. The idea that, as you say, bad things have happened, huge upheavals, societal challenges have happened, and yet, we've kept going. No matter how bad things got, humanity keeps finding a way to keep on.
The only thing I remember from Assyria land is I was forced by some Irish alcoholic, private school teacher to memorize the first stanza of Byron's The Destruction of Sennacherib. And all I have in my mind all the time is the Assyrians came down like the wolf on the fold, and their cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea as the blue wave rolls nightly on deep Galilee. And that is all I'm going to contribute in our podcast about the Assyrians for gratuitous quotations.
The thing that stuck with me from reading this book, and if people aren't familiar with it, you should buy it. It's a wonderful book. But the thing that stuck with me most from reading that book was he talks in the introduction about this letter, basically, that a young Assyrian man who was living in southern Mesopotamia, like Babylonia, wrote a letter back to his mom in, the Assyrian part of Mesopotamia, complaining that the clothes that she was making and sending to him weren't fashionable enough. And I thought, this is like just teenagers throughout history. This is, thousands of years ago. And my daughter would write that same letter today to me if she could. So yeah, it's just like, that was the thing that stuck with me, is just like how similar we are, no matter how much the difference is or how long the time passes between us. Everybody kind of wants the same thing. They want to look cool and be popular.
Yeah, some things never change. I got to shift us off teenage gripes about fashion, although I'm sure we can all relate. And Danny, I actually have a question specifically for you, but of course, Derek, feel free to chime in as well. I have had a particular drum that I've been banging for the last however many years. I've been having trouble finding bedfellows about this, and I found one on your Twitter today, and I want to talk to you about it, which is that I have an intense frustration with people critiquing Trump by calling him a fascist. And in particular, then the next connection that people make is with Hitler. So if you want to talk to people about why Trump is worrisome, for whatever angle you want to approach that, the conversation very quickly with a lot of people who vote for the Democrats is he's going to be the next Hitler, and we're going to have concentration camps and blah, blah, blah. So I would love for you to get on your soapbox about that, both why it's wrong and what better ways it would be to critique what's happening with Trump right now than to call him a fascist.
No, of course. So I wrote a long essay about this for the New Republic a couple of years ago. I believe it's called "It Didn't Happen Here" or "Does American Fascism Exist?" They use different titles for the online version and the print version. But in effect, that I think you actually need to historicize fascism and understand it as a proximate response to several of the things that were going on in the early 20th century. The first thing, of course, is the proximate trauma of World War I. which killed millions upon millions of people in Europe. It dispossessed people. It gave people incredible stress and trauma. And it led to a lot of young men with war experience roaming the streets of the 1920s and early 1930s Weimar with combat experience. The literal development of the state was at a much earlier level. So it was possible for radical movements in Italy and Germany, Weimar Germany, what became Nazi Germany, to do something like seize state power in a way that isn't possible today. Fascism is also a response to two crises: the crisis of industrial capitalism that obviously reflected itself in the Great Depression, but also the crisis of the left to fail to realize its quote unquote revolutionary potential. And so fascism was organizing around the crisis of capitalism and also in response to it left. As you can see, none of those conditions hold today whatsoever. And probably the biggest one is that I don't believe we're living in an era of mass politics where masses of people are able to organize and to do things like actually shift the state in a particular direction. That happened both in fascist Italy and in Nazi Germany. I think if the history of the United States, for example, suggests anything over the last several decades, going back to at least the ending of the draft in the early 1970s, perhaps even earlier. It turns out that a lot of historians are skeptical about the degree to which even the anti-Vietnam War protests wound up shaping the war. But it's pretty clear that mass politics don't really affect things here. There's many studies showing that even if you're organized, the thing that matters is that you're a business person and you have access to capital. That is what ensures that your feelings are actually heard in the halls of power. And there are several studies showing this. So none of the conditions for fascism hold here. And I think it actually is an analogy that occludes much more than it illuminates. I think Trump is part of a longstanding American tradition going back to the very early republic, perhaps most instantiated in a figure like Andrew Jackson, but really present earlier, particularly amongst various constituencies around the founding fathers. But essentially, he's an authoritarian populist. Is that he is someone who wants to use the authoritarian structure of the American executive, the American president. And I think we need to appreciate the degree to which the president is really an authoritarian position. The American state is effectively run through the presidency. Famously, Congress has not declared war since 1942. Good thing the United States hasn't been in war since 1942. So it's already an very imperialist institution like Jackson or like other figures throughout American history, William Jennings Bryan, perhaps, Yu Long, perhaps. He's appealing to populist sentiments in the service of an authoritarian politics. That to me is what he is doing. And I think actually importing a term like fascism is also wrong because it doesn't work politically. If this last election showed anything, you could call Trump a fascist. Most Americans smell BS when they smell BS, and they don't think that Trump is actually a fascist. And I think in some almost perverse sense, importing a term that's so distinctly tied to early 20th century European history actually separates Trump from American history. It's not like racism, xenophobia, genocide, imperialism are fascist inventions. There's quite proud American traditions of all of those things. And I think you actually have to look to American history to understand Trump, and you have to look to his proximate origins as a post-war baby boom New Yorker to understand where he's coming from. Fascism doesn't get you much. It's wrong empirically. It doesn't get you much analytically, and it's useless politically. I think it basically functions as a political curse word, which is fine. Like that's great. Identifying someone as fascist, you're effectively saying they're outside of normal politics, just like identifying someone as communist or Marxist does the same if you're on the right. It's the exact same function, but it doesn't lead to understanding. And it very clearly didn't lead to effective resistance. So for all of those reasons, it should be discarded.
I mean, it's a bedtime story, right? It's a bedtime story for people who want to...
For sad libs.
Yeah, who want Trump to be something other. Fascism, to call somebody a fascist is sort of other-coded. It's the outside of the norm. It's outside of the American system. But we don't want to talk about all the ways, Danny, as you just outlined, that Trump fits very comfortably into American history and American traditions. There's a certain group of people, and I think this probably gets more traction among the sort of never Trump Republican, all five of them or however many there are at this point. who really don't want to reckon with the fact that Donald Trump comes very comfortably out of the Republican Party's, history over the last few decades. But it gets play also among liberals who want to tell this story. And it's funny how everybody's got their own mythic version of American history at this point. Nobody seems to want to talk about the reality of it. But they want to tell their own myth about American history where Trump is, something completely unique that's never been seen before and comes from outside. And we can all, rest our heads that this isn't what the United States really is. This is something different.
It's funny. I mean, I've been making this argument since 2016. I do not make it as a self-identified member of the left. It's like every few years America wakes up and is like shocked that they're a complicated, flawed society.
Can't believe there's gambling in this casino.
Exactly. And I think there's a degree to which and this was sort of amazing 2021 to 2024, like nothing to see here, kind of, like, oh, well, oops, we had a moment, we lost our minds, we, locked down in COVID, and now we're fine. We're back. We're done.
It does seem like Biden wasn't there all the time mentally, and that literally there were unelected people governing. I mean, like, it's incredibly bad what Elon Musk is doing, but to argue that only the Republicans have unelected people making crucial decisions is just a flat out lie.
Yeah, it's also a flat out lie to say, I mean, everybody in the executive branch, except for the president, is de facto unelected.
That's how Henry Kissinger got in. He wasn't elected. He was brought into the National Security Council. It's just a lie. And I think this is one of the reasons that the Democrats are doing poorly. They lie and they have no positive program. And you don't have to know the entirety of American history to smell BS. And I think a lot of people just smell BS around the party, which is not willing to do the one thing that would win it votes, which is redistribute money. They don't want to do that. So they're trying to push the conversation onto anything else, and it won't work.
Yeah, I mean, there I happen to disagree, just because I do think we actually do de facto redistribute quite a bit of money. We may not distribute it well or effectively or as much, but we are. I mean, there is a tax code that is inherently redistributive in the United States. Let's not get into a whole critique of capitalism.
I mean, it does help to explain November, right? Like the idea that Trump is an aberration means, we got through his first term, we voted him out of office. Now everything can go back to normal. You can all go back to brunch. We're all fine. Everything's going to just keep chugging along the way it was chugging along before. And so you walk in to 2024 with nothing to say, nothing positive to say about the problems that people are facing, everyday problems that people are suffering with and how you're going to deal with them, because your whole message has been
don't vote for Trump. Right.
I think still stuck back in 2016. America is already great, and there's nothing that we really need to do to change it or fix it. This is it. This is just what we are.
So let's talk China, because I know you guys have written a lot about that. Em and I, there's been a bunch of episodes. I wrote a book about this once where I made what is now clearly a voice shouting in the wilderness, except I'm in no way, I didn't either lose my head nor did anybody listen. So clearly we are entering something resembling a Cold War with China, although it's not really the right analogy, because you could have counted literally on one hand the amount of economic interaction with the Soviet Union, even into the 1970s when we were buying and shipping some grain to the Soviet Union somewhat.
I was going to say there was some wheat in the 70s. Yeah.
But even then, like, it was de minimis relative. Whereas the economic intertwinement with China is not just massive directly, but it's massive indirectly. It may change over time, but it certainly remains the case. Nonetheless, we are in this. China is well cast for a national security establishment that was looking for a unitary state enemy with nukes and weapons. ISIS was never, and Al Qaeda was never, quite the right graft for that institution. Look, I mean, I say I'm not part of the left because I'm not, and I disagree with a lot of the analysis you're saying, but then there are things that I'm saying, but actually some on the right believe this too. I mean, this is where these categories get a bit muddled. Anything we can do about this? I mean, from my perspective, that ship has kind of sailed. Doesn't mean you shouldn't keep saying, hey, wait a minute. And look, Xi has done nobody any favors. I mean, you could say, look, we helped create the modern version of Xi, but that's a little like saying, Ukraine provoked the Russia invasion. I mean, there's truth to it, but it doesn't justify it. So he's been an equally toxic partner in a toxic relationship.
Well, I mean, I think the writing is just on the wall. The United States is not going to be able to remain hegemonic in East Asia. This is not, in 25 years, the United States will not be hegemonic in East Asia. And it's a total fantasia of the national security bureaucracy. Like, as you said, I would say, because it's been so influenced by liberal thought, has basically moved from existential enemy to existential enemy, from the Soviet Union to humanitarian interventions to global terrorism to China, to Putin, and now back to China, now that no one cares about Ukraine anymore in the United States. The reality is that this is going to happen. So the question is, what is the regional transition going to look like? What I think it will look like is that China does something incredibly provocative, like attack Taiwan in 15 years. The United States says, oh, we're probably not going to fight World War III over this, and in effect abandons its allies. That to me is very much possible. What I would like to see is a more planned and rational security transition where the United States just doesn't cut and run and abandon its allies in South Korea or Japan or Taiwan, but actually prepares them for a world in which the United States is not going to be any longer regionally hegemonic in East Asia, because of course it's not going to be any longer regionally hegemonic in East Asia. I wrote a long piece about this for Harper's several years ago, where if you just look at the economic indicators, the United States' share, the G7's share of global GDP, its relative power has been in sharp decline. It's in sharp decline for decades. And in fact, we've outpaced the rate of decline that was predicted even 3 years ago. We could have whatever the national security establishment could try to sort of reinvigorate itself by concocting a ridiculous new Cold War with China. It's just not going to change the fundamentals on the ground. That's my ultimate take on the US-China relationship. So the smart thing to do, seeing that this is likely inevitable unless China implodes, which is possible but unlikely in my opinion, is to actually start to facilitate the security transition and also start to seriously work with China on the global issues that we need to work on, which is the basic ones: climate, pandemic, inequality within and between countries. Of course, the United States has no interest in doing that. Look at these aforementioned institutions. The United States has gotten furious several times when China starts to assert itself in international institutions, because only we're allowed to do that. So I think we're an incredibly retrograde national security establishment isn't going to do much.
What would it actually look like, though, to prepare Taiwan for a attack from China, though? I mean, like in no world is Taiwan going to successfully fend off the Chinese if that's what they decide to do now.
Precisely. So there are certain realities of international relations that I think people abroad are going to have to accommodate themselves toward. I mean, you could try to build up the Taiwanese defense industrial base. I think maybe you could reach a situation, a sort of like one country, two systems type situation over time. But there are just certain realities of international relations that exist. And then you have to ask yourself, is it worth fighting a World War III over with a nuclear armed mega power? I mean, these are the uncomfortable realities of geopolitics, but they shouldn't be ignored or basically pushed off into fantasy land, which is what the United States national security establishment, the blob, does and has been doing for decades, because they've been shielded by U.S. hyperpower. That hyperpower, I would say, has already gone away, and it's going to attenuate even more going into the future.
I mean, I think that the appropriate way, if you're going to continue to arm Taiwan, is not to think about it in terms of resisting a Chinese invasion, but in terms of making an invasion costly enough that the Chinese government thinks maybe this isn't such a good idea. But what it would really take, I think, is an awareness on the part of the U.S. of our own history, and on the Taiwanese government, on the part of the Taiwanese government of recent U.S. history, and the fact that what the United States security establishment tends to do is to prop up our proxies, make them dependent on U.S. weapons, make them dependent on U.S. financial support, and then eventually, because the political system in the U.S. is what it is, pull the rug out from under them. So that's what happened with the government in Afghanistan. That's what happened. That's what I think is happening with Ukraine. You know, it's this concept of maintaining conflict and giving, the proxy, whatever the proxy is, just enough to kind of continue to sustain the weapons sales, to sustain whatever, positive or whatever goals the US sees coming out of these conflicts, but eventually not creating the kind of durable structure or independent structure that could allow those proxies to act for themselves and make decisions for themselves. And instead, they're left vulnerable to the eventual shift of the political winds, and things crumble at that point. So, what it would take is starting from that framework. And I think, supporting Taiwan with what it would need, not to fight a war, but to prevent a war, to deter a war. And then, as Danny said, you could talk about things like a one state, two system type of arrangement, or some kind of interaction between Taipei and Beijing that brings diplomacy into it and further forestalls the possibility of a conflict.
Right. And it's also equally clear that the United States, the domestic American public, is not prepared for their sons and daughters to die on the shores of Taiwan, full stop. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. I mean, I'm sure we could ratchet up enough heat. You'd really have to work on that for a bunch of years. We're kind of toward the end. I want to ask a final question of both of you, which is kind of what does one do now tactically? So I might disagree with some of the prescriptions of the left, but if you feel you want to exert some sort of constructive pressure, change something on Trumplandia, given that, absent some incredible implosion of the administration, it is what it is for the next 3+ years. You want to have some positive utility, right? In writing, thinking, speaking, rather than just aimlessly shouting into the wind and having a few people who agree with you go, right on, man, right? I mean, there is something to be said for shouting to the amen chorus. It makes one feel at least heard, but it doesn't necessarily lead to anything. So what do you do? I suppose this is tactical as much as strategic. What's the constructive approach to deal with a reality that is flawed? I mean, you guys are in a somewhat better position. And to some degree, you're saying, look, the reality has been flawed. It's not suddenly flawed. It's not like it wasn't like fine before January of 2025. It's been messed up for the whole time. So you're probably in a better position to kind of deal with the reality of flawedness than others who are like,
Well, I mean, there's very clearly one thing to do, and that is to subscribe to the podcast American Prestige, which is the first step in any anti-Trump movement. I actually think that the most important task right now is mostly analytical, because I think that a lot of the ways that we understand politics in the 2020s are shaped in an occluding way by how politics functioned in the 20th century. That we still use the language of mass politics, the metaphors of mass politics to understand how to enact political change. But I believe the nature of politics has transformed because the American state has shown itself totally resistant to ordinary people's influence and has throughout much of its history, but I think there's been a ratcheting up in the last several decades. So the first thing to do, and I think both liberals and the left could unite on this, is actually understand how politics really functions. Is it really just, as it seems, that the rich matter and everyone else doesn't? And if that's the case, we need to figure out what to do about it. But I don't think there's a clear tactical approach because the state is so closed off from the influence of ordinary people.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that we come back to again and again on our show, which is it's ever more removed from any interaction with everyday voters. The system, the foreign policy system in particular, is further and further taken out of the realm of popular politics. It started with, the development of the national security state. It continued with, we can talk about all the benefits of an all volunteer military versus the draft, but one of the effects that has is it removes even the idea of going to war or fighting a war from the day-to-day lived reality of most people. We're now, into automated warfare, drones, things that don't even things that involve at best a human being sitting behind a screen somewhere, so not even on a battlefield. It's even further removed. We're going to get to the point where AI is running these things, which means there's not even going to be a person behind a screen necessarily doing anything. So it gets further and further automated and away from any lived reality. And I think without understanding what that means and how, I mean, there's still a way for people to influence, I think, politics and to influence the direction of U.S. foreign policy. But I don't know that we know what that is right now because it's a much different world than it was 50 years ago. So I think Danny's right. The first thing that needs to be done is we need to figure out how this world works. And then you can understand, you can try to figure out what the levers are.
Appreciate the honesty on that front.
yeah, absolutely. It's a good answer to all that. And, we will see how this all unfolds. Keep doing the work you're doing. I'm glad you're engaging the conversation with us. Part of the point of the Progress Network is to engage a wide variety of voices that are trying to create constructive change, whether that's from the left, the right, the center, the middle, the far out, the alien, the not. I think, this question of how does one remain an engaged citizen is vital. And that's true for anybody of any political spectrum. That's the challenge of democracy, right? You shouldn't just be engaged when you kind of like what's going on. You should be engaged, full stop, always. So I want to thank you for that. I encourage people to look at your work. listen to your podcast. And thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you both.
So, Emma, I thought that was, there's obviously a lot more to unpack there. It's an interesting time of whatever your self-anointed label is. Are you a left? Are you progressive? Are you on the right? Are you a never Trumper? Are you a radical Trumper? Are you a MAGA Trumper? All these categories, while they may exist in people's hearts and minds as static things, are clearly more fluid in terms of the critiques that they lead to, right? Because one of the things interesting about the conversation we just had is aspects of what Trump is doing that are kind of recognizing maybe America's interest isn't in being the global policeman and the global hegemon. Maybe it's just being a really powerful country that does what it wants, which has its own problems, but is very different than the model of the foreign policy establishment for the past 70 years.
We're really just talking about horseshoe theory, aren't we? I think that there are some ways in which that holds true for those guys. I mean, we didn't get to talk about this very much. We referenced it, but we didn't get directly into it about how the kind of like the new right in their sort of America first isolationism and the discussion about what should be done about Ukraine is a departure from the right, or what the right has been doing for the past, let's say, 30 years at least. I don't think that those lines have completely settled yet. I mean, they clearly haven't even settled within what I'm randomly calling the new right, because on the one hand, you have Ukraine. On the other hand, you have Trump's comments about Gaza and the US, you just kind of moving in and taking over there. Whether that is going to become a reality, who knows? But the fact is, it's not exactly a coherent message.
Totally. Although I think the Gaza fantasy is more of a non-militarized real estate development project, which makes zero sense, but is, from the musings of Trumplandia, is more of that than it is a imperialist expansion.
That is an imperialistic expansion, isn't it? And you'd
Sure.
have to use the military to get there. So.
Yeah, that part remains largely unspoken. Also, because it's completely untenable, right? I mean, imagine Americans supporting, the dispatch of the Sixth Fleet to shepherd Palestinians elsewhere.
I don't know. It's like you'd want to believe that, but we went into Afghanistan, we went into Iraq. I mean, certainly it can be done. So
never say never.
Insofar as convincing people, I mean, not like it can be done, like we should do it, but convincing people that it should be done is possible, right?
I guess that's true. Anyway, we probably should do some more on foreign policy, and these changing frameworks are fascinating, and I think we'll get more and more interesting as the way things were begins to fracture more. And on the optimism question, there is out of fracturing is possibility, right? It is always opening. So you can see it as destructive or you can see it as breaking open. And whether or not the likelihood of that is great, the opportunity of that is always present. And that is definitely true in Trumplandia. That there is a degree, or there could be a degree, of breaking open that is an opening to a different way of doing things. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm also not prepared at this juncture to say it won't happen.
Okay. Let's leave it at that.
So
let's see how this ages in a month. Yeah.
So thank you all for listening. Tune in next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Sign up for our newsletter, What Could Go Right, on theprogressnetwork.org. Send us your comments, your complaints, your interests, your questions, and we will try to address them. We value your time. We thank you for giving some of it to us. And we will be back with you next week.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.